You're listening to the Big Cast, your source for the latest in financial technology. Brought to you weekly by the Best Innovation Group, with your hosts, John Best and Glenn Sarvati.
Welcome to another edition of the Big Cast. My name is Glenn Sarvati on behalf of the Best Innovation Group, where we like to do cool things with financial technology. And today we've got a pair of interviews, pretty much current events today. Things that are kind of brand new and happening in real time as far as how credit unions and fintechs can be working in this area. Jason Sturek of the Defense Credit Union Council was kind enough to speak to us just a couple days ago. He's been leading the charge to ensure the credit unions play a role in the $1,000 newborn accounts that have been created by the new tax and spending bill that was approved by Congress back on July 3rd. So we'll be hearing a little bit more about the details of that. And our friend Lou Grilli and I also got into the details of one of the other provisions in that big, beautiful bill, as it's known. The complexities of the whole concept of the no tax on tips promise and how that may play out. And I had some theories that he did a pretty good job of kind of dispelling in the conversation, but give you a chance to take a listen to that yourself. I'll remind you for now, you can always find out more about the Best Innovation Group by checking out our website, big-fintech.com. And I've got a new website to point you to. I want to specifically draw your attention to the Best Innovation Group's newest service. It's actually set up at a separate website, bigmerger.ai. You can actually get to it from the main site. If you go down to services, you'll find a drop down for that, bigmerger.ai. Don't bother trying to search Google on big merger. I did that, and you just wind up, it tries to tell you about big mergers that have happened lately. No, we're not talking about big mergers. We're talking about mergers that big helped to execute. And what this is all about is AI accelerated merger execution for credit unions. Most recently, it was Utah Community Credit Union, UCCU, and TransWest. The Best Innovation Group team helped support them. And they did a core systems merger in a mere 5 months. Anybody in that space knows just how rapid fire that really is. And zero downtime for their members. We're working on other ones already, but the key here is that AI has proven to be a great device and tool with the human in the loop, as we always talk about, to actually execute these things more rapidly. And as we all know about the way AI works, the more you use it for a purpose, the better it gets because it learns. So as additional mergers take place, and there's plenty of them in the works in the credit union space, this seems to be a great way to work through the details of bringing those organizations together in the back office. So you can find out more about that by checking out bigmerger.ai. Let's just get right to the main event. The topic today basically are the offshoots of the tax and spending bill that was passed by the Senate, revising what was passed by the Congress a few weeks earlier. Don't worry, we're not going to go to any political rat holes here. We're really focusing on the areas where this has direct implications, and just regulatorily in general, actually, for credit unions and fintechs, about some of the interesting moves going on in the administration and how that affects policy right now. And one of the ones that really caught my attention was Jason Sturek. And kudos to the CU Daily for pointing this out as well, because they've kind of taken the lead on this one a bit too, in terms of reporting and quoting Jason Sturek about the fact that this is a really important issue, particularly for overseas deployed. Think about it. They're the age of childbearing age, people who are probably starting families, and they need to have access to their trusted financial advisors. Where are they going to open these $1,000 newborn accounts? So Jason was kind enough to sit down and talk about exactly how he sees that credit unions can play a role in this. So let's have a listen. I'm here with Jason Sturek, the Chief Advocacy Officer for the Defense Credit Union Council, who graciously agreed to join us on short notice. I've been fascinated by this notion of the newborn accounts that will be providing $1,000 to every new American born in the years 2025 through 28. Jason, I understand that the Defense Credit Union Council sent a letter this week to the Department of Treasury, making sure the credit unions have a role to play in this process.
Yeah. Yes, we did. We wanted to make sure that, after this law, was signed, after it was signed into law on July 4th by President Trump, that, and it charges, the Treasury Department to set this program up, that the secretary knew of the defense credit unions, but honestly, all credit unions, excitement and willingness to participate in this program as another financial tool that's going to be available for its members, and the new members that come along, as your family grows, as part of this program.
Well, you make a really good point, particularly with, overseas defense credit unions, obviously, the armed forces, the military service overseas, obviously childbearing age. So that makes sense. In most cases, as you point out, the one place that these folks may have to actually bank and the one that they're familiar with and trust is their credit union. So it's just the natural destination where they'd be looking to set up this relationship as well.
Yeah, and that was kind of the nugget of why of our specific interest with the bill is that, as the hundreds of thousands of American service members, and as important, and their families are deployed overseas at bases, pretty much the only financial banking option that they have on those U.S. bases is a credit union, so that as they go to the base hospital, for that blessing of childbirth and their child is born, that they already have a local institution, their defense credit union on that base that they work with on a day-to-day basis for their everyday, financial life, that this can be incorporated into that pre-established relationship of trust that's already been built up.
To me, that's it may be their only option, but more importantly, it's the option they've already built up this trusted relationship with.
Obviously, I mean, as a parent, you're probably going to get bombarded from multitude of companies that are set up to, be the place where these deposits are made.
I hadn't thought about that. We're going to a sudden new direct mail campaign as soon as
you might
you
might have it, and that. As you're walking out the front door of the hospital, you have people coming up and asking, or being targeted, for the deposit of these quote unquote checks, for the newborn. We want to make sure that credit unions are a part of the process that builds this system out, but is also at the table and included and treated as equally as the banks are, as this moves forward in all financial institutions, because with something as important as the future financial stability and resources available for your child, you're talking to a dad who scrimps and saves, to make sure that he's putting $500 to $600 a month away into his kid's 529. That this is the same thing, so that as that $1,000 is that foundation, and you can put additional funds into it, that you work with a financial institution that you got your car loan with and your home loan with, or your credit cards with, because you can walk right into that front door at a credit union all across this country or on a military base and say, what's happening, what can I do, what options you have available, and it's people that and trust.
And just to kind of clarify, and again, we don't know the details because it's relatively vague. The meat has to be put on the bones on this, but we're talking about, I mean, I've seen it referred to as savings accounts, but we've kind of discussed it's probably more like a brokerage account, I'd say.
I think you're going to see some sort of hybrid. I think the language is specific to, a safe and secure, or like you're like a fund that's based upon the Standard & Poor's 500.
I saw a low cost index fund.
Yep.
I don't think this is supposed to be.
Funds, yeah.
We're not talking actively managed. We're talking about something pretty passive here. I mean, you have to. It's not like a savings thing. It can lose value, I think, by definition.
Exactly, but the hope is that over a long period of time, that that as a family unit, and that as that $1,000 grows, that it becomes part of that foundation of financial literacy that's so important to this administration, but also embedded in the DNA of credit unions, that as a part of getting your checking and savings account set up, you already know that you've got this account, so that how to save and how to use those resources to help build your financial future.
I mean, if $1,000 put into the S&P 500 today isn't worth more than $1,000 in 18 years, we got bigger problems.
Absolutely, there's a lot of other problems in the economy at that point, but it also allows the parents to and family members, they have birthdays and other events, is my understanding, to deposit additional funds into this account.
Yes, my understanding is the vision is also it may become a new, kind of way for matching funds or whatnot from a employer.
Absolutely, and I think that's fantastic. But that was kind of the genesis of why we wrote our letter, why we've been talking to our credit unions about how this can be an opportunity as an additional financial tool that is going to be made available. It's now signed into law that credit unions can and need to talk to their members about to ensure that they are taking advantage of all of the financial opportunities out there. Because if they don't choose to where to put that money, the government's going to put it in an account for you. So
it's all going into a private account. That's the other thing I think some
yes.
people don't understand. The government's not going to sit on this money like Social Security. They're going to push it into some private institution.
Right, and that's where the relationship in the relationships that have been built by credit unions over decades of work with individuals and their families is going to come into play. Because that when I am trusting my child's future with someone, I want to know it's someone that I've done business with in the past.
Yep. So I think you've kind of started to address this, but at this stage of the game, what should we be looking for next? What should credit unions be doing now to get prepared? Because obviously this is already applicable to babies that have been born for the last 6 months.
I think that they need to start having talk. They need to talk about it. At their, within the credit union, within their leadership, that this is something that's coming. Obviously, everyone needs to wait for Treasury to put out the rules, but the flexibility that when that happens, because this is going to start, I believe, January 1 of 26. So we've got under 6 months to get this entire program built up, so that we're going to do our best at DCUC to be informing our members and the entire credit union industry of information as it goes out. But that's why we want to be a part of this from the beginning as much as possible, but to be available, to answer questions from the members, so that when these $1,000 checks, I'm just calling that checks, become available, that they can work with those families to ensure that, hey, we got the new kids, got the saving account, got their checking account. Oh, here's their baby bonus check.
So, and fortunately, we've got people like you kind of watching. I mean, to make sure that we don't get lost at the table or excluded from the table for this conversation. I guess that's your next order of business, to kind of see how the working groups get formed.
Yeah, obviously, we'll make sure we're going to be as squeaky of a wheel as possible on this to make sure that credit unions are at the table. We'll also be reaching out to members of Congress, as I'm sure many of them will be interested in how this program is set up. And there'll be a multitude of opportunities when Secretary Bessent or other Treasury officials are up in front of Congress, in front of many committees, that we'll be encouraging questions to be asked of them for updates and information that can be shared.
Great. Jason Sturrock, Defense Credit Union Counsel, Chief Advocacy Officer. Always appreciate your insights. Thanks for jumping on so quickly on one of several exciting new and rather unclear issues that we need to get and sort through in the here and now.
Thanks so much, Glenn. Good to talk to you.
So as you'll hear throughout this episode, one of the recurring themes here is it's not very clear. These laws were, frankly, in my mind, very hastily put together. Maybe intentionally so, to keep people from, if they were too precise, maybe it would have, created a little bit more resistance by a few of the votes and a razor thin margins that were needed to pass them. But because of that, it's not 100% clear how some of these things are going to be executed. Hence the need to have task forces and things like that Jason's mentioning, and getting the seat at the table is pretty important. Let's kind of take a sidestep for a second. Here's a piece that did not get into the big, beautiful bill that the big tech is actually concerned about right now. The House version of the tax and spending bill actually placed a 10-year moratorium on any AI regulation being imposed at the state level. That one did not pass muster, and it's interesting because it was kind of a strange bedfellows kind of situation where it was some folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene on the far right, along with staunch consumer advocates like Elizabeth Warren, saying, wait a second, why are we doing this? Why can't states, especially if the federal government isn't going to step forward and do that regulating? The claim was, well, and I think this makes sense, that you want consistency across the board. So, but if the federal government steps up and does that, that's great. The federal government hasn't stepped up to do that. That moratorium got stripped out of the bill, so those state laws can continue. I thought this was interesting. I was reading this in the Wall Street Journal. I'll post a link to that. But one of the comments that was made was, don't hold your breath for any federal regulation on this through 2026, because it's incredibly complicated, and B, it could alienate some folks that as we get into a campaigning season, that may wind up impeding some of their ability to collect campaign contributions. The quote I thought that the article ended on that I thought was particularly telling: Congress has limited bandwidth for such a complex, high-stakes policy effort. On the other hand, that's kind of what they're there to be doing. So but the bottom line is, the tech world is trying to figure out, all they're saying is we need a set of rules. It's funny how when we really get down to it, regulation, if it's common sense and actually lays the rules out very explicitly, probably isn't such a bad thing, as opposed to a total confusion or different hodgepodge of things that might be coming out from different states. Then we have another one that was issued, a regulation that was issued and then subsequently pulled back under the new administration, Section 1033, which we've talked about quite a bit, open banking. That was all set to take place. It was official. It was a final rule, but it has now been rescinded. Just last week, and we'll post a link to this as well, JP Morgan Chase has announced, and Bloomberg News was the first to report this. Payments.com has got a piece on it as well. Actually, our friends at FinTech Business Weekly have a nice write-up too. JP Morgan Chase announced that they are going to begin charging for the data aggregators for access to customer info. And as the article says, this could upend many fintech business models. Really? You think so? That one's going to be interesting. The lack of ability for the credit unions and the banks to even get cost recapture on the expense that they were going to be incurring to provide this data was, in my mind, a fatal flaw of the 1033 rule in the first place, and I think was probably going to wind up getting sorted out along the way. But now that we've thrown the whole thing out, we're back kind of to the Wild West. We've also been saying all along, the big banks are going to keep doing this stuff, but it's kind of interesting now that you've got a one-way negotiation going on about here's the price for the data. It's also interesting that all parties seem to acknowledge before that it is the customer data belongs to the customer, but it's the bank charging for it. This story is not over. I'm going to be really curious to follow along on this one and see where that's going. The other big item that I think really has implications for the credit union world is the no tax on tips, and for the fintech world as well. There's one more in there that I'm going to leave out of this conversation, which was no tax on overtime. It's not, again, that's a very shorthand statement that isn't really what's happening. I don't think the overtime one has as many implications for the financial institution world, at least in the near term. No tax on tips, though, when I actually dug into the detail about what they're asking, from a reporting standpoint, the IRS and whatnot, it started sounding an awful lot to me like the Interchange Fee Prohibition Act, the no interchange on tips and taxes that was passed in Illinois and is now gummed up in the court system. So as I started thinking about that, I thought I needed another well-informed person to kind of bounce this off. Enter our good friend Lou Grilli, until recently from Valera. So we wound up just kind of shooting the breeze about this one. So have a listen and see what you think about this topic. Got my good friend Lou Grilli here, who until recently was the manager of innovation at Valera, and he is officially kind of pulled the exit cord on his full-time employment. Congratulations on that, Lou.
Thank you, Glenn. Always a pleasure to be talking with you. Yes, I did. I retired from Valera to focus on life, getting the house back together after the flood and the wind damage from 2 back-to-back hurricanes. I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, and to travel some more. But I still have some irons in the fire, still staying involved, doing some consulting for credit unions, talking about stable coins, consulting with vendors to help them get in the credit union space. So I still have some things that I'm working on. More recently, getting ready to attend World Credit Union Conference.
I was going to mention, you've already got one of those kind of gigs representing one of the larger credit unions in the country is with heading out to Stockholm, Sweden, I believe. And by the time this airs, I think you will be there.
By the time this podcast drops, I'll be in Stockholm, hopefully over the jet lag. It's a 6 hour time difference.
Oh yeah, the whole European continent. That's right. Well, the main thing I wanted to talk about today, because we've been trading notes on this one for a while, and I thought it was more productive than me trying to just go into a monologue, than go back and forth on it, is the no tax on tips provision in the big beautiful bill. And it's interesting. You don't seem to have the same perspective that I do on this one, but I feel that I'm getting deja vu with some of the complexities and the challenges of tracking this that comes out of the Illinois Interchange Fee Prohibition Act, which of course has been held up by the courts and is not happening for different reasons. I'm not saying that's going to happen with this, but the logistic challenges of how to track this information from a reporting standpoint strike me as both pretty significant and also quite similar. I know that you mentioned you don't necessarily see it that way.
I guess, yes, I will agree with you that this is an additional burden on, in the case of the Illinois Interchange Prohibition Act, the merchant, in this case, on employers of tipped employees. And just for lack of a better word, I'll call them, it could be hotel room staff, but I'll say restaurants,
Yeah, that's
just to
the
make it
obvious
easier.
case, I think, for the most part.
And to me, the difference is first, no tax on tips makes for a great soundbite, but in reality, that's not how it's really going to work.
Exactly.
Tipped workers are not going to see a difference in their paychecks. The employer, the restaurant, may not have to, will not be doing anything different regarding how much they pay. There is some additional reporting to the IRS, but right now, the that information is readily available. They know the restaurant knows how much the server gets per hour, and then knows the how much that tipped server is getting from tips, and also which employees get tips and which
Well,
ones
there's a
don't.
caveat on that, though, too, right? They know how much they're getting from electronic payments. The cash drawer, they probably don't know. Anything that's just left on the desk there on the table, that doesn't show up on the W-2.
True, but that's the case that's supposed to be reported today anyway. So
Exactly.
the
It's supposed to, but it's the reporting requirement here is what really gets me.
Uh, agree. It seems like the information, though, is a lot more readily available than in the case of the Illinois Prohibition Act, where the burden that's placed on businesses or ISO to either change the routing or change the authorization amount into taxes plus tip versus the remainder for real-time interchange calculation, or they left this rebate route in the Interchange Prohibition Act, where the merchant basically brings the shoebox of receipts to presumably their merchant acquirer or a third party who specializes in somebody who specializes in obtaining rebates for the interchange paid on tips and taxes. To me, those are the ability to discern wages versus tips in the first case, the no tax on tips, versus to be able to separate out taxes plus tip versus the rest of the credit card charge. That seems like a big order of magnitude
Yeah.
difference in data collection and data reporting.
Now that you say it that way, I heard the magic words, kind of real-time transmission, is because I'm really focused on the reporting aspect, and that you are correct that this is all the things I'm thinking of to create the complexities can all be taken care of on the back, can be taken care of in the back end. How much work it takes is another question, but you do raise a good point. It is much more complex to try to parse out those tips from the actual amount of the bill. I'm just going to what I'm reading, that this is the piece that I'm kind of focused on that I think creates added complexity. It's only quote unquote qualified tips
Right.
that qualify, hence the name. But those amounts to qualify in that fashion must be paid voluntarily without any consequence in the event of non-payment. They cannot be the subject of negotiation, and they must be determined by the payor. And then they very specifically call out any mandatory service charge, such
Hmm.
as an amount that's added to the bill for large parties. There's also an increasing number of, and I'm guessing this doesn't come into play nearly as much. This is much more common in Europe, but in the US, you're starting to see a few more high-end restaurants that just apply a flat service fee to the bill. So that would not qualify either. Those
Right.
folks are probably making more money, that I'm guessing that they probably weren't going to get a big break out of this anyway.
Agree. So yeah, it applies to servers. The say front of house, back of house though typically does not get tipped. So that's why there's now a burden on the restaurant to state what the employee's qualified occupation is. So that is a new burden.
But it's beyond the qualified occupation. I'm just thinking, I don't know, depending on the type of restaurant, I wonder what percentage of tips run through oh, you're a party of six or more, therefore we're automatically adding 18% to the bill. In theory, that has to be broken out now.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
I don't know how you do that. I honestly don't know how you do that. That sounds like, I mean, we're talking about ADP. I mean, nobody does their own, W-2s. They've got to have some kind of a feed that's going through to somebody else. And the other thing I keep coming back to is this is now applicable for the entire calendar 2025, working year. Nobody was even thinking about this stuff for the first 6 months. So how do
Yeah.
you actually go back in arrears and get all this information?
A good question. So here's where there's a lot of commonality, is the law is passed and details are basically left to the reader. And it doesn't seem like there's no obvious answers to some of these
Amen.
questions that we're
Amen.
raising.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
And go,
and I wonder to some extent, I think it was left vague because any greater specificity might have created more objections enough to, jeopardize the ability to pass at a razor thin margin.
and just to go back to something you said, just to be clear, the restaurants that charge a mandatory, 18% or whatever it is for parties of six or more, that then would not qualify for this deduction.
Correct.
Hmm.
And that's where I don't think anybody, I can't think of anyone who breaks those out at this point. So you've got to create a whole new process to track that separately.
And there is a lot of minimum wage tipped workers that either don't pay taxes or do get refunds that aren't even going to be eligible to claim the full 25,000 amount or even something
Oh,
less than that.
not even close. I mean, I'm just, I forget where I read this, but what my understanding is of the qualified workers that this would apply to, which is only from what my understanding about 2.5% of the US working population. So it's a pretty big administrative burden to deal with 1 out of 40 people, which really becomes 1 out of 60 because what I've read is that roughly 1/3 of the people who would fall in this category, mainly restaurant workers, don't pay taxes because they actually fall below the thresholds you were just talking about. So we're talking about a lot of work for a pretty small number of people. And again, one of the things you mentioned, the Department of Treasury, this is written in the bill, has 90 days to determine which workers this applies
Right.
to. So we
I
don't
yeah,
really
saw
know
that
that
too.
yet.
Hmm.
We have a pretty good idea, but we don't totally. And you and I were just talking about this before we started. One thing that's a little bit unclear, I've heard that there's a kerfuffle going on right now in the Reddit threads and whatnot. Uber drivers, DoorDash type, online commerce folks, they're not W-2 employees. They're 1099 employees.
Correct.
Almost everything I've read about this refers to W-2. So they're like, wait a second, what about us? It has to be on your W-2. We don't have a W-2.
Hmm.
I have to believe that that's actually going to be the the tech lobby was pretty strongly behind this law. So I've got to believe they're going to be included, but that means all the 1099s, which have never separated tips, are going to have to be totally redone as well.
True. Yeah.
And that's going to be an interesting one. But there's again, it's the lack of clarity that makes it, particularly when the train's left the station. We're 6 months into the year, and this is already going on. From a credit union standpoint, I mean, what do you think the implications are? It's like, are the members maybe not necessarily clear on what their income looks like or what their tax status will be at the end of the year? How do you see credit unions kind of playing into this?
That's a good question. My initial answer to that is I don't, at least for the time being, credit unions won't notice any difference because the tip worker will not notice any difference in their paycheck, assuming that that tipped worker is a credit union member. And it's not until that tip worker goes to file their taxes, so we're talking about, early, sometime up to April 15th of 2026, is when there may or may not be a difference in how much money they get back. And that's the
Yeah.
first time that we'll see any actual financial activity.
Or either a very well-informed or possibly a misinformed worker may think that they no longer have to set aside as much for taxes and may start, either spending more or paying down more debt. And hopefully that turns out to be the case at the beginning of next year when the actual
Mhm.
tax calculation takes place.
as opposed to, since you brought up the compare and contrast against the Interchange Prohibition Act, that does impact every merchant that does business in Illinois, regardless of whether it's a Illinois resident or somebody visiting Illinois, anybody using a card with any of those merchants.
That's another. Yeah, you make very good points, Lou. That I mean, this is a drop in the bucket
Right,
compared to what's
right.
happening in Illinois or any place else that tries to deal with the whole, you know, interchange on tips or interchange on taxes and things like that, which is what's about. And again, that's on hold right now, pending some legal. Well, the Illinois legislature passed a 1-year extension in the first place, so it goes into July of 2026. And I think everyone's hope, I think, is that there's some judicial clarity in terms of
Hmm.
the legality of it before that happens.
Right.
But thanks. This is exactly what I was hoping you would help me kind of hash out in terms of this conversation. In the other piece of things, like you said, you're heading to the World Credit Union Conference. What are you kind of focusing on there? I think are there certain things that you've seen in the agenda that particularly kind of strike your
Funny you
curiosity?
mentioned that. I literally was just going through the app, flagging the breakouts that I want to attend. And two things kind of came to my mind as I was looking at the breakouts and the subjects of the keynotes. One is this international perspective, right? So I attend frequently, a lot of times with you, league meetings, GAC, NACUSA, which are obviously all focused on the US market, as
Yep.
one would expect. But for example, for this conference, none of the keynote speakers are from the US. And yes, regulatory environments and politics and tax issues really vary widely by country, but I'm curious to see how topics that pretty much are shared by all credit unions around the world, the topics that I was just scrolling through, member experience, AML, youth banking, the impact and use of AI, I'm scrolling through the breakouts here. How are these seen from potentially a different lens than the one I bring? And the other thing that I'm looking forward to, kind of a just personal goal of mine, I'm attending this conference I'm a volunteer for one of the top 10 credit unions in the US, and I hope to network with peers, that is, volunteers, board members, and supervisory committee members, because I'm really curious to hear the differences and similarities that we share.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've never made it to the World Council
Me
Conference.
neither.
And you've even more. I've got a little more FOMO. I already had FOMO for not going to Stockholm, but I've got more FOMO in terms of the way you kind of laid that out, getting those distinctions. If I can add one to the mix that I'd be really curious to hear is the extent to which the same kind of turf battle and animosity between credit unions and banks may or may not exist in other geographies.
Oh, good one.
I think that,
I'll
and
add that to my list.
some of that dynamic may be different just because the U.S. has so many more banks than and particularly the animosity tends to be on the part of the community banks that see that the credit unions they perceive an unfair advantage they receive. So yeah, if you can kind of test the waters on that and anything you come back with on all those topics, hopefully we can reconnect later in the summer months and you can give us a readout.
Oh, I would love to do that.
Lou, it's always a pleasure. No longer representing anybody but Lou Grilly for the purposes of this conversation, but we always
Correct.
appreciate talking to you.
Okay, take care, Glenn. Thanks for having me on again.
So, like I say, I really appreciate Lou's kind of walking me through his thoughts. I think he changed some of my thinking. I still find this one to be very confusing. The other one that I'm really wondering about is where the 1099 employees are going to come out on this. The wording of it makes it sound like 1099s are exempt. I have a hard time believing that's going to hold. Again, one of those things, hastily written, not really very clear. Without Chevron deference, if you've been following that, I mean, the whole idea was we used to just kind of push it on to the experts in the quote unquote deep state that would figure out how to implement these things. Well, I'm not sure it's as easy to do that because they're supposed to be getting their guidance from Congress and they haven't given them a whole lot of guidance in some of these cases. With that, another episode of the Big Cast in the books. Again, my name is Glenn Sarvati. You can track me down via my firm 154 Advisors. I'm somewhat active on Blue Sky. I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can find me at either of those locations, as you can the Best Innovation Group at JB FinTech and at Big FinTech. The JB FinTech is for our grand poobah, John Best. Big FinTech for the company overall. You'll find all kinds of great stuff if you go out to either place, but always the big-fintech.com website as well, where you find all things Big FinTech and Big Merger and mergers with and without the Best Innovation Group getting involved, but mostly ones where we do get involved. That's about it for this week. Like I say, you can always find new content. Every Tuesday we post new interviews. We got another one, another interesting one about deposit and CD rates coming up next week. So hopefully you'll check in for that. If you are picking up the podcast via Apple Music, Spotify, or any of the other apps, Amazon Music, please do set a reminder, if you would, like the podcast, whatever it takes to get a reminder that we've got new content out there. And we always love hearing from you. Drop us a note, let us know what you think. So you can always find out more there. You can also find our back archive of episodes on any of those earlier referenced podcast vehicles, or directly at the Best Innovation Group website if you click through on the media tab. Until then, thanks as always for listening.
Check back each week for the latest from the Big Cast. Or better yet, we hope you'll consider subscribing for free via Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Tweet us at Big FinTech, email info@big-fintech.com, or visit us at big-fintech.com and click on the Media tab, where you can post a comment or check out our archive of hundreds of past episodes. See you next week.